The morning of December 23rd, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann crouched behind the glacis plate of his Panther OSV, watching through binoculars as American columns retreated westward along the frozen road. For 5 days, his company had pushed the Allies back, exactly as the Führer had promised. The 88mm KWK-42 gun mounted in his turret had proven itself again and again capable of penetrating any Allied armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. The Americans had nothing that could stand against a Panther in open combat. Everyone knew this. German tank crews had been told since Normandy that Allied armour was inferior, hastily manufactured, mass-produced garbage designed by a nation more concerned with quantity than quality. The Sherman tank, they were taught, was a rolling coffin. Its 75mm gun couldn't penetrate Panther frontal armour, even at point-blank range. The American tank, destroyers, they'd encountered the M10 Wolverine with its 3-inch gun, were equally impotent against German engineering. Hartmann had seen 3 Shermans burn in a single engagement 2 days earlier, their crews abandoning vehicles before his gunner even fired a second shot. This was the reality of armoured warfare in December 1944, or so he believed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Hartmann didn't know, what German intelligence had failed to comprehend, was that something new had arrived in the Ardennes. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer, mounting a 90mm gun derived from anti-aircraft artillery, had been rushed to the front in November. Only a handful of American commanders even knew these vehicles existed. German tactical manuals contained no information about them. The supreme confidence of the Panzerwaffe, built on 2 years of technical superiority in Western Europe, was about to collide with American industrial adaptation. Within 6 days, a single American tank destroyer battalion, equipped with M36 Jacksons, would destroy 72 German Panther tanks in a stretch of Belgian countryside no more than 15 kilometres long. This is the story of how German tankers discovered that the 88mm gun they'd relied upon since North Africa had finally met its match, and how that discovery came far too late to change the outcome of Hitler's final desperate offensive in the West. To understand the psychological shock that awaited men like Klaus Hartmann, we must first understand the worldview that shaped every German tanker in late 1944. The 88mm gun had achieved almost mythological status within the Wehrmacht. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon in the 1930s, the Flak 18 and its successors had been adapted for anti-tank use during the Spanish Civil War. By 1941, German crews in North Africa discovered that the 88 could destroy any British tank at ranges. Those tanks couldn't even hope to return fire. This wasn't propaganda. This was documented, battlefield-proven superiority. British Matildas and Crusaders, Soviet 34s and KV-1s, American Shermans and Lees, none could withstand a direct hit from an 88mm armour-piercing round. The psychological impact on German crews cannot be overstated. Tankers knew that if they could position their vehicles properly, if they could achieve first-shot advantage, they were virtually invincible. Training manuals emphasized this reality. New crews were taught that German tanks didn't need to outnumber the enemy, they simply needed to outshoot them. One Panther could theoretically engage and destroy 5 or 6 Allied tanks before those tanks could close to effective range. This wasn't arrogance. Statistical analysis from Normandy showed German armour achieving kill ratios of 4-to-1 or better against Allied tanks in many engagements. When American and British forces invaded France in June 1944, they brought with them thousands of M4 Sherman medium tanks. The Sherman was reliable, mechanically sound, and produced in staggering numbers. Over 49,000 would eventually be manufactured. But it was also inadequately armed and armoured for combat against German heavy tanks. The standard M4 mounted a 75mm gun that fired a shell weighing approximately 15 pounds. The Sherman's frontal armour measured roughly 2.5 inches at its thickest point. By contrast, the Panther tank that began appearing in significant numbers after Kursk mounted the KWK-42 a 75mm gun with a barrel so long 70 calibers that it achieved muzzle velocities exceeding 3,000 feet per second. The armor-piercing round it fired weighed over 15 pounds but travelled 50% faster than Sherman ammunition. More critically, the Panther's frontal armor measured nearly 4 inches thick, sloped at 55 degrees, giving it effective protection equivalent to 6 inches of vertical plate. American tank crews in Normandy quickly learned what this meant in practice. Engagement after engagement followed the same pattern. Shermans would spot German armor, close to effective range for their 75mm guns, typically under 1,000 yards, and fire. Their rounds would strike Panther frontal armor and simply bounce off, leaving nothing but scratches in the steel. The Panther would rotate its turret, acquire the target, and fire once. The Sherman would brew up, as crews grimly termed it, bursting into flames as ammunition cooked off. American tankers developed desperate tactics. They learned to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, hoping one Sherman could flank a Panther while it was engaged frontally. They learned to target tracks and gun barrels, mission-killing German tanks even if they couldn't penetrate armor. They learned to call for air support the moment German armor appeared. But these were survival tactics, not solutions. The fundamental imbalance remained. American tank destroyers offered some improvement. The M10 Wolverine, based on the Sherman chassis, mounted a 3-inch gun, actually 76.2mm, in an open-topped turret. This gun had better armor penetration than the standard Sherman 75, capable of penetrating roughly 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards under ideal conditions. Against a Panther's frontal armor, this still wasn't enough. The M10 could penetrate Panther side armor at medium ranges, and crews learned to use ambush tactics, but head-to-head engagements remained suicide. By autumn 1944, American commanders understood they had a crisis. Intelligence reports from France showed that German tank formations, despite being outnumbered and outgunned in terms of artillery and air support, were achieving tactical victories in armor versus armor combat far more often than acceptable. The Sherman was being upgraded, the M4A3E8 Easy 8, with improved suspension, and a new 76mm high-velocity gun was entering production. But even this gun, while better than the 75, remained marginal against Panther frontal armor. The British had developed the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a genuinely powerful weapon capable of defeating Panther armor, and were fitting it to modified Shermans called Fireflies. But American doctrine didn't favor the 17-pounder, and production of Fireflies went to British and Canadian units. What American ordnance officers needed was a tank destroyer that could reliably kill Panthers and Tigers at the ranges those German tanks operated. The solution already existed in an unexpected place: anti-aircraft artillery. M1 90mm anti-aircraft gun had entered service in 1940, designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers. It fired a shell weighing 24 pounds at muzzle velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. Ballistically, it was remarkably similar to the German 88mm flak gun that had proven so effective in the anti-tank role. In 1943, American engineers began developing an armor-piercing round for the M1. By early 1944, they'd succeeded. The 90mm M37 armor-piercing shot could penetrate over 5 inches of vertical armor plate at 1,000 yards. Against sloped armor like the Panthers, penetration was reduced, but the 90mm still had roughly double the penetration capability of the Sherman's 75mm gun. The challenge was mounting this weapon on a mobile platform. The M1 anti-aircraft gun weighed over 8 tons with its carriage. Simply bolting it to a Sherman chassis wasn't feasible. The recoil would tear the vehicle apart. Engineers needed to design a new turret, new recoil systems, new ammunition storage. The project began in spring 1944. The resulting vehicle, designated M36 gun motor carriage, used the M10A1 chassis itself, a modified Sherman hull with a new, larger turret mounting a specially adapted version of the 90mm gun designated M3. The turret had an open top, like the M10, which tank destroyer doctrine considered acceptable, since these vehicles were meant to fight from ambush positions rather than brawling like tanks. Armor protection was minimal. The M36's turret face was only 2 inches thick, and hull armor matched the Sherman's. But armored protection wasn't the point. The M36 was designed to kill German heavy tanks before those tanks could effectively return fire. Production began in June 1944. The first vehicles reached Europe in September, issued to a handful of tank, destroyer battalions in France. American crews who'd been fighting in M10s received minimal training a few days to familiarize themselves with the new gun's ballistics and the slightly different handling characteristics. What they learned impressed them. The 90mm gun could engage targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards with reasonable accuracy. More importantly, it could penetrate Panther frontal armor at ranges where the Panther's return fire remained dangerous but not certain to penetrate the M36's thinner armor. For the first time since Normandy, American armored units had a vehicle that could fight German heavy tanks on roughly equal terms. German intelligence completely missed this development. Captured M36s from the September and October fighting were misidentified as modified M10s. After-action reports mentioned American tank destroyers with heavy guns, but provided no specific details. The truth was that German tactical intelligence in late 1944 was fragmentary at best. Fuel shortages, limited reconnaissance flights. Radio intercepts were difficult when American forces used secure telephone lines for tactical communications. Prisoner interrogations yielded little. Most American tankers didn't know exactly what gun their vehicles mounted, only that it was bigger than before. When Hitler ordered the Ardennes offensive in December, his commanders planned the operation, assuming they would face the same Allied armor they'd fought since June. Shermans with 75mm or 76mm guns, M10 tank destroyers with 3-inch guns, and British Fireflies in limited numbers. The possibility that American tank destroyer battalions might be equipped with weapons capable of defeating Panther frontal armor at extended range never entered German planning documents. The German offensive that began on December 16, 1944, relied fundamentally on achieving tactical surprise and rapid breakthrough. Hitler had assembled his last strategic reserve, 3 armies, totaling over 400,000 men and more than 1,200 tanks and assault guns. The plan called for armoured spearheads to punch through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest to capture the port of Antwerp. Success depended on speed. German planners knew they had perhaps 1 week before Allied air superiority and reinforcements would strangle the offensive. The armoured formations leading the attack included some of Germany's most experienced units: the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and the Panzer Lehr Division. These formations brought with them significant numbers of Panther tanks, the Panther AUSF-G, the latest production variant, mounting the long-barreled 75mm gun and frontal armor that had proven nearly impenetrable in earlier fighting. For the first 3 days, the offensive achieved remarkable success. American units in the Ardennes were indeed thinly spread. Some divisions held front lines stretching over 20 miles. The sudden assault by overwhelming German forces shattered defensive positions. Entire American regiments found themselves surrounded, roads clogged with retreating vehicles. The weather, critically, prevented Allied air forces from intervening. Thick clouds and fog grounded the fighter bombers that had harassed German movement since Normandy. For German tankers like Klaus Hartmann, those first 72 hours seemed to validate everything they'd been promised. The Americans were retreating, the Panthers were performing flawlessly. The 88mm guns were destroying any resistance they encountered. But German intelligence had made a catastrophic miscalculation about American dispositions. The 7th Armoured Division, a veteran formation that had fought through France, had been positioned in reserve north of the initial breakthrough sector. When the offensive began, the 7th Armoured received orders to move south immediately and establish blocking positions around the town of Saint-Vith, a critical road junction that German spearheads needed to maintain their advance schedule. Attached to the 7th Armoured Division was the 643rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. This unit had received M36 Jacksons in October. By December, its crews had 2 months of experience with the 90mm gun. They understood its capabilities. More importantly, they'd developed tactics specifically designed to exploit those capabilities against Panther tanks. The 643rd arrived in the Saint-Vith area on December 17th. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel James Harper immediately deployed his companies into defensive positions along the likely German approach routes. Harper understood that tank destroyers fought most effectively from ambush. The M36's open-topped turret made it vulnerable in sustained firefights, but its gun gave it the ability to engage German armour at ranges where German tankers wouldn't immediately recognise the threat. Harper's operations officer, Captain Robert Lang, selected firing positions with specific criteria. Clear fields of fire, extending 1,500 to 2,000 yards, covered withdrawal routes, and natural terrain features that would conceal the M36's hull-down positions until the moment of firing. Company B of the 643rd, commanded by Captain William Wilson, established positions along a ridgeline overlooking the road from Schönberg to St. Vith. Wilson deployed his platoons in a reverse-slope defence, the M36s, positioned just behind the crest of the ridge, where they couldn't be seen from the valley below. Forward observers with radios occupied foxholes on the forward slope. The tactic was simple. Wait until German armour entered the killing zone, then crest the ridge, fire, and withdraw before German tanks could range in effectively. The first test came on December 18th. At approximately 0900 hours, a German column appeared on the Schönberg Road. Forward observers identified at least 12 Panther tanks advancing in a spaced formation, with infantry in half-tracks following. The Panthers moved cautiously, their crews aware that American forces might be in the area, but confident that any engagement would favour their superior armour and firepower. The German commander couldn't know that concealed on the ridge above him were 4 M36 tank destroyers, with their 90mm guns already loaded with armour-piercing ammunition. Captain Wilson waited until the German column had committed fully to the road. At 1,200 yards range, he ordered his vehicles forward to firing positions. The M36 crews had practiced this manoeuvre repeatedly. Within 15 seconds, all 4 tank destroyers crested the ridge and acquired targets. The Creeding 5, lead M36, commanded by Staff Sergeant Howard Mills, fired first. The 90mm armour-piercing shot crossed the 1,200 yards in less than 2 seconds, and struck the lead Panther on its glacis plate just right of centre. At that range, with that angle, the M77 projectile carried sufficient kinetic energy to defeat even the Panther's sloped frontal armour. The shot penetrated. Inside the Panther, the armour-piercing round fragmented, sending white-hot steel fragments through the crew compartment. The tank rolled to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from hatches as surviving crew members bailed out. The 3 other M36s fired within seconds. 2 more Panthers took frontal hits. One exploded immediately the penetrating shot had detonated stored ammunition. The other slewed sideways as its driver was killed or wounded. The 4th American shot missed, passing just over the turret of its target. But the damage was done. The German column had lost 3 vehicles in under 30 seconds to an enemy they couldn't even see clearly. The remaining Panthers attempted to return fire, their turrets traversing toward the ridge, but the M36s had already reversed down the slope and were repositioning. By the time German gunners acquired aim points, the American tank destroyers had disappeared. For the German tank commanders, this engagement was deeply disturbing. Panthers weren't supposed to be knocked out by frontal hits at 1,200 yards. Only British 17-pounders and Soviet 122mm guns could reliably penetrate Panther frontal armour at that range. The Germans had encountered neither in this sector. The only explanation was that the Americans had deployed some new weapon, but what? The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. By 09:30 hours, Company B had withdrawn to alternate positions 2 kilometres west. The German advance continued, but 3 Panthers remained burning on the Schönberg Road. This pattern repeated. Throughout December 18th and 19th, M36 platoons from the 643rd engaged German armor at multiple locations around St. Vith. The American tank destroyer crews refined their tactics with each engagement. They learned that the 90mm gun could penetrate Panther side armor out to nearly 2,000 yards, far beyond the range at which Panther gunners expected threats. They learned to target the junction between hull and turret, where armor was thinner, and a penetrating hit would often cause catastrophic ammunition fires. Most critically, they learned that German tankers, conditioned by 2 years of armor superiority, often advanced aggressively when they encountered resistance, believing they could simply overwhelm American positions with superior firepower. This aggression made them vulnerable to ambush tactics. By December 20th, the 643rd had destroyed 28 confirmed Panther tanks in the St. Vith sector. German casualties included the complete loss of 2 Panther companies from different divisions, roughly 30 vehicles combined with the 643rd accounting for most of those kills. German after-action reports from this period show increasing confusion about what they were facing. Some reports claimed American units were using captured German guns. Others speculated about new British weapons. None correctly identified the M36 or its 90mm gun. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weather cleared on December 23rd. Allied air forces immediately began attacking German columns throughout the Ardennes. But even before air power tipped the balance, the German offensive had lost critical momentum. St. Vith, which should have fallen on December 17th or 18th, held until December 21st. That 4-day delay disrupted the entire German timetable. Fuel shortages, already critical, became catastrophic as German spearheads sat immobile waiting for supplies. The American defense of St. Vith, enabled significantly by the 643rd Tank Destroyer, battalion's ability to blunt German armoured attacks gave American commanders time to rush reinforcements into the First Theatres. Ardennes. The 101st Airborne Division reached Bastogne. The Third Army began its famous wheel north toward the German salient. German commanders now faced a second crisis. Their Panther battalions had suffered unsustainable losses. The Wehrmacht's armoured strength in the west had peaked on December 16th. By December 26th, over 100 Panthers had been destroyed or abandoned, mechanical failures and fuel shortages accounting for many, but direct combat losses were significantly higher than predicted. Intelligence officers began piecing together reports from tank crews who'd survived, encounters with American tank destroyers. A pattern emerged. American vehicles, appearing similar to the M10 Wolverine, were achieving penetration on Panther frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. This should have been impossible. The M10's 3-inch gun couldn't perform that way. The conclusion was inescapable. The Americans had deployed a new tank destroyer with a significantly more powerful gun. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann learned this truth on December 24th. His company had been ordered to attack American positions west of Manhay, a small Belgian village where American forces had established a blocking position. Hartmann commanded 5 Panthers, all that remained of his original company of 14 vehicles. Losses to mechanical breakdown, air attack, and combat had reduced the formation steadily over 8 days of offensive operations. His orders were simple: break through the American position and secure the road junction beyond. Intelligence reported. Only light American forces in the area, infantry with some tank support, no mention of tank destroyers. Hartmann's company advanced at 0700 hours on Christmas Eve morning. Visibility was poor fog hung in the valley, reducing sight lines to perhaps 800 meters. The Panthers moved in a wedge formation, Hartmann's vehicle in the lead. They'd covered roughly 2 kilometers when Hartmann spotted movement ahead American infantry, withdrawing across a field. He ordered his gunner to engage with machine gun fire, suppressing the infantry while the Panthers advanced. This was standard tactics. Use the Panthers' firepower to push back resistance, then exploit the breakthrough before the enemy could organize a counterattack. What Hartmann didn't see was the M36 platoon concealed in a tree line 500 meters to his right flank. Lieutenant Robert Chen commanded this platoon from the 643rd Company C. Chen had positioned his three M36s in a textbook ambush site, hull down behind a low rise, with clear fields of fire across the valley. When the German Panthers appeared, Chen let them advance into the killing zone. At 600 yards range, presenting side armour, the Panthers were perfectly vulnerable. Chen's gunner, Corporal James Martinez, acquired the lead Panther in his sights. The side armour of a Panther Ausf. measured 40 mm less than 2 inches thick. At 600 yards, the 90mm M37 armour-piercing shot would pass through that armour as if it were paper. Martinez fired. The shot struck Hartmann's Panther just below the turret ring on the right side. The projectile penetrated completely, passed through the crew compartment, and exited through the opposite side of the hull. Hartmann remembered later in a post-war interview conducted in 1947 that the sound was unlike anything he'd experienced. Not the clang of a ricochet, which he'd heard when Soviet 76mm rounds bounced off his armour in Russia. Not the dull thud of a partial penetration. This was a sharp, tearing sound, followed immediately by screaming. His gunner had been killed instantly. His loader was wounded. Smoke filled the fighting compartment. Hartmann ordered his driver to reverse, but the engine wouldn't respond. The penetrating shot had damaged the transmission. The other two, M36s, fired almost simultaneously. Another Panther took a side hit and exploded. A third Panther, its commander realizing the ambush, attempted to traverse its turret toward the threat. Before the German gun could bear, Chen's second M36 fired again. This shot struck the Panther's turret face thinner than the glacis plate at only 100 mm thick. At 600 yards, the 90mm gun punched through. The Panther's turret crew died immediately. The remaining two Panthers in Hartmann's company retreated in confusion. Chen's platoon fired several more shots but scored. No additional hits. Within 90 seconds, the engagement was over. 3 Panthers destroyed, 1 damaged, 2 escaped. Chen's platoon had expended 7 rounds of 90mm ammunition and taken no casualties. Klaus Hartmann survived. His driver managed to bail out and drag Hartmann from the burning vehicle before ammunition cooked off. German infantry recovered them later that day. Hartmann was evacuated to a field hospital with burns and shrapnel wounds. In his 1947 interview, conducted by American military historians studying the Ardennes campaign, Hartmann described his state of mind after the engagement. He'd believed absolutely in the Panther's superiority. Every aspect of his training had reinforced this. The 88mm gun could kill at ranges where Allied guns were ineffective. The armour could withstand anything the Americans deployed. These weren't opinions, they were battlefield-tested facts proven in hundreds of engagements since. Normandy. The realization that American tank destroyers now mounted guns capable of defeating Panther armour fundamentally shattered that worldview. Hartmann told his interviewers that the psychological impact exceeded the physical injuries. German tankers had learned to fear Allied air power and artillery. But tank versus tank combat had remained a realm where German technical superiority provided security. That security was an illusion. The Americans had adapted. They'd deployed weapons that matched or exceeded German capabilities, and they'd done so with such speed that German intelligence had completely failed to detect the threat before it arrived on the battlefield. The 643rd Tank Destroyer Battalion's performance during the Battle of the Bulge became a case study in effective weapons deployment. Between December 17th and December 23rd, a span of just 6 days, the battalion destroyed 72 confirmed German armoured vehicles. Of these, at least 62 were Panther tanks. Additional kills included several Panzer IV tanks and a handful of assault guns. The battalion's own losses during this period totaled 11 M36 tank destroyers, a kill ratio of better than 6-1. More importantly, those 11 losses came primarily from German artillery and air attack, not from tank versus tank engagements. In direct combat with Panthers, the M36 proved decisively superior when employed with proper tactics. This success reflected several factors. First, the 90mm gun provided American crews with a weapon genuinely capable of defeating German heavy armor. The ballistic performance of the M3 90mm gun closely matched that of the German 88mm flak series. American armor-piercing ammunition, while initially less sophisticated than German tungsten core rounds, proved adequate for penetrating Panther armor at combat ranges. Second, American tank destroyer doctrine emphasized ambush, tactics and positional warfare rather than mobile engagement. The M36, despite its thin armor, excelled in this role. Crews learned to use terrain, establish multiple firing positions, and disengage before German forces could bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Third, and perhaps most significant, German tankers in December 1944 remained psychologically conditioned to expect armor superiority. This conditioning led to tactical aggression, advancing into engagement zones without adequate reconnaissance, exposing vulnerable side armor, assuming they could overwhelm any resistance through firepower alone. Other American units equipped with M36s achieved similar results. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 3rd Armored Division, destroyed 41 German tanks between December 26th and December 30th as Patton's Third Army drove into the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The 638th Tank Destroyer Battalion accounted for 37 kills in the northern sector. By January 1st, 1945, American tank destroyer battalions equipped with M36s had destroyed over 200 German armoured vehicles in the Ardennes. The Panzerwaffel's last strategic reserve had been shattered not primarily by Allied air power or artillery, though both contributed significantly, but by American armoured forces that had finally achieved rough parity in tank-killing capability. German tactical responses to the M36 evolved slowly. Initial after-action reports recommended more cautious advanced tactics and better reconnaissance, but fuel shortages and deteriorating battlefield conditions made such recommendations largely meaningless. By early January, German armoured formations in the Ardennes were fighting for survival, not conducting offensive operations. Panthers that survived the initial battles often fell victim to mechanical breakdown or fuel exhaustion. Crews abandoned dozens of vehicles as the German retreat accelerated. Those Panthers that remained operational faced not only M36s, but also increasing numbers of Sherman EZ-8s with 76mm guns and British Fireflies with 17-pounders. The temporary armour superiority Germany had enjoyed since 1943 had decisively ended. The broader implications extended beyond the Ardennes. By February 1945, over 300 M36 tank destroyers had reached the European theatre. Production in American factories was accelerating. Over 1,800 M36s would ultimately be built. Tank destroyer battalions that had struggled with inadequate M10s received priority for conversion to the new vehicle. American tactical doctrine shifted subtly. Tank destroyers, previously considered specialized defensive weapons, began operating more aggressively as commanders recognized that the 90mm gun gave them offensive capability against German armor. In the Rhineland campaign, during the crossing of the Rhine, and in the final battles in central Germany, M36 platoons routinely engaged German armor at ranges and in circumstances that would have been suicidal for earlier American tank destroyers. The German response to the M36's deployment revealed deeper Wehrmacht failures in late-war intelligence and adaptation. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had been largely dismantled in 1944 following the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler. Intelligence gathering fell to a patchwork of military units, SD security service operatives, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance, none coordinating effectively. The result was that critical information about Allied weapons development simply never reached tactical commanders. Even when M36s were captured or photographed, the analysis of this new weapon system took weeks to reach frontline units. By the time German tankers received tactical bulletins warning about American 90mm tank, destroyers, most Panther companies had already encountered them in combat. The institutional failure went deeper. German tank design in 1945 remained fixated on bigger guns and heavier armor. The Panther II project, the Tiger II King Tiger, and various super-heavy tank concepts consumed engineering resources that might have been used to improve production of existing designs or develop more practical weapons. The fundamental problem that German industry couldn't produce sufficient numbers of tanks to replace combat losses received no effective solution. German tank production peaked at fewer than 2,000 vehicles per month in late 1944. American tank production exceeded 2,000 vehicles per month throughout 1944. When quality approached parity, quantity became decisive. Klaus Hartmann spent the remainder of the war in a military hospital, then in a prisoner of war camp after Germany's surrender in May 1945. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. In his post-war interviews, Hartmann reflected extensively on the psychological dimensions of his experience. German tankers, he explained, had been taught to view themselves as an elite force, equipped with superior technology. This belief wasn't entirely propaganda. It had basis, in fact, through early 1944, but it created vulnerability to psychological shock when that superiority evaporated. The appearance of the M36, capable of destroying Panthers at ranges where Panthers had previously operated with impunity, shattered the fundamental assumption underlying German tactical confidence. Hartmann noted that many German tank crews who survived the Ardennes campaign and fought in the final battles of 1945 operated under profoundly different psychological conditions than earlier in the war. They no longer assumed they would win tank versus tank engagements. They no longer trusted that their armor would protect them. They fought defensively, cautiously, often retreating rather than engaging when faced with American armor. This wasn't cowardice. Hartmann insisted on that point repeatedly in interviews. It was a rational adaptation to changed circumstances. But it meant that German armor, even when technically superior in specific instances, failed to achieve battlefield effects proportional to its quality because crew psychology had shifted from confidence to wariness. American tankers who served in M36 crews reported strikingly different experiences. Sergeant Howard Mills, whose first shot destroyed a Panther on December 18th, described the 90mm gun as providing confidence we'd never had before. Previous American tank destroyers required perfect positioning and often multiple hits to kill Panthers. The M36 could kill with a single well-placed shot at ranges where the crew felt reasonably protected. This psychological shift toward confidence mirrored the German shift toward caution. American crews began seeking engagement with German armor rather than avoiding it. Tank destroyer battalions reported higher morale and lower rates of crew stress casualties after receiving M36s. The technical specifications tell part of this story. The 90mm M3 gun fired an armor-piercing projectile weighing 24 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. Against a vertical armor plate, this projectile could penetrate approximately 6 inches at 1,000 yards. The Panther's frontal glacis, sloped at 55 degrees, had an effective thickness of roughly 6 inches when calculated for angled penetration. This meant that at 1,000 yards, under ideal conditions, the M36 could penetrate Panther frontal armor, though reliability was uncertain, and most crews aimed for side shots when possible. At 600 yards, the range of Hartmann's final engagement, penetration of Panther frontal armor, was virtually guaranteed. Side armor, only 40 millimeters thick, could be defeated out to 2,000 yards or more. By contrast, the Panther's Cougar 42 75mm gun, while excellent against medium tanks, struggled against the few American heavy tanks deployed. The M26 Pershing, which began reaching Europe in February 1945, had frontal armor exceeding 4 inches thick. Panthers could penetrate this armor, but required precise shot placement at under 1,000 yards. More significantly, the Panther's gun was optimized for a threat environment, Soviet 34 tanks and American Shermans, that no longer fully represented what German crews encountered. The Americans had adapted their armor mix. The Germans had not adapted their response. The M36's success vindicated a particular approach to weapons development, incremental improvement using existing components rather than revolutionary new designs. The 90mm gun existed. Sherman-based chassis existed. Engineering the two together took less than a year from conception to battlefield deployment. By contrast, German late-war projects like the Maus Super Heavy tank or the E-series standardized tank designs consumed years of development time and never reached production. The Wehrmacht's technological sophistication, once an advantage, had become a liability. Complex designs required complex manufacturing. Supply chains couldn't deliver specialized components. Maintenance in field conditions became nearly impossible. The Panther, sophisticated and powerful, required roughly 3 times as much maintenance per operating hour as a Sherman. In sustained combat, mechanical reliability mattered more than maximum performance. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last occasion where German armoured forces operated offensively in significant strength. After January 1945, Wehrmacht armoured units fought defensive battles, typically outnumbered, increasingly immobilized, by fuel shortages, and facing Allied forces equipped with weapons that had closed the capability gap. The appearance of the M36, along with other late-war Allied improvements, meant that German tankers no longer enjoyed the psychological security of technical superiority. They fought bravely, accounts from both sides confirm this, but they fought without the confidence that had characterized Panzer operations earlier in the war. Klaus Hartmann survived the war, returned to civilian life in Germany, and worked as an engineer in post-war reconstruction. He maintained contact with several American veterans, including Lieutenant Robert Chen, whose M36 platoon had destroyed Hartmann's Panther on December 24. In 1972, Hartmann and Chen met at a military history conference in Belgium. Chen described the meeting in a later oral history interview. The two men discussed their December engagement in detail, comparing their perspectives. Chen remembered targeting what appeared to be the lead German tank in a column, not knowing it was a company commander's vehicle. Hartmann remembered the shock of penetration, the sudden understanding that his armor wasn't invincible, the scramble to survive. Both men emphasized that the engagement, which lasted perhaps 90 seconds, had seemed eternal while it occurred. The conversation between Hartmann and Chen revealed something profound about the nature of technological warfare. Both men had fought with courage and competence. Both had relied on their training and equipment. The outcome of their engagement depended not on individual skill, though skill mattered, but on the industrial and engineering decisions made months earlier in factories thousands of miles from the battlefield. The American decision to develop and rapidly deploy a 90mm tank destroyer gave Chen's crew a decisive advantage. The German failure to anticipate this development, to adapt tactics, or to provide effective counter-weapons left Hartmann's crew vulnerable. Individual soldiers bore the consequences of strategic decisions they had no control over. The 72 Panthers, destroyed by the 643rd Tank Destroyer Battalion in 6 days, represented more than statistics. Each destroyed tank meant 5 crew members killed, wounded, or captured. Each represented months of manufacturing effort, scarce materials, skilled labor, all wasted. But more significantly, those destroyed tanks represented the collapse of German operational planning. The Ardennes offensive required rapid breakthrough and exploitation. Every day of delay, every blocked road junction, every defensive position that held longer than expected accumulated to transform tactical setbacks into strategic failure. The M36 tank destroyers didn't defeat the offensive alone. Weather, logistics, Allied reinforcements, and German fuel shortages all contributed. But the M36's ability to blunt German armoured attacks at critical locations like Saint-Vith provided American commanders the time they needed to organize effective defense. The legacy of the M36 extended beyond World War II. The vehicle served in the Korean War, where its 90mm gun proved effective against Soviet-supplied 34 tanks. Modified versions remained in service with various armies into the 1960s. The basic concept mounting the most powerful available anti-tank gun on a mobile chassis with minimal armor influenced post-war tank destroyers and light tank design. More broadly, the M36's rapid development and deployment demonstrated that American industrial and engineering capacity could respond to battlefield requirements with remarkable speed when properly organized. The interval between recognizing the need for a heavier tank destroyer and fielding the M36 in combat was roughly 18 months. German development cycles for new armored vehicles often exceeded 3 years. For German veterans like Hartmann, the memory of December 1944 carried lasting significance. The confidence they'd felt in earlier campaigns, the certainty that German engineering superiority would prevail, had been revealed as hollow. American forces, written off as technically inferior and industrially focused on quantity over quality, had produced weapons that matched or exceeded German capabilities. The 88mm gun, the centerpiece of German anti-tank capability, had met its match. The psychological impact of this realization, Hartmann suggested in interviews, exceeded even the physical trauma of being burned out of his tank. It represented the collapse of a worldview, the final acknowledgement that Germany was losing not just battles, but the fundamental industrial technical competition that modern warfare demanded. The morning of December 23, 1944, began with Klaus Hartmann believing his Panther tank was nearly invincible. It ended with him understanding that belief had been an illusion. The Americans had adapted. The Germans had not. Within 6 days, 72 Panther tanks would be destroyed by a weapon German intelligence hadn't known existed. The supremacy of the 88mm gun, established over 3 years of warfare, ended not with gradual erosion but sudden shock. For the men who experienced this transformation, both those in the Panthers being destroyed and those in the M36S doing the destroying, the Battle of the Bulge marked the definitive end of German armoured superiority. The tide had turned, and unlike earlier reversals, this one was final. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.